My guest today is Sir Angus Deaton, Nobel-winning economist, professor at Princeton, and author most recently of Deaths of Despair, co-authored with Anne Case. And I want to ask him what he thinks the future of despair might look like in a post-COVID world.
So the story we tell in the book is that the world has really come apart for less educated Americans. In part because of familiar forces like globalization, the China shock, all that sort of stuff. Perhaps even more importantly because of automation. And also one of the things we focus in the book that's perhaps new is the incredible costs of the American healthcare system, which costs 18% of GDP, and which, because it's paid through employment, but on what is essentially a poll tax basis, and that you and I pay about the same as a less educated worker would do, then it takes sort of a wrecking ball to the low educated labor market. This generates this sort of despair, and there's tremendous social consequences of this. So almost every social dysfunction we look at is getting worse for this group. But if you look at people with BAs, it's really not happening. Okay, so you get this situation, and all of a sudden COVID comes along. So what is COVID going to do to this? Well, it's going to make everything worse. So, the whole of the American working class, whether black or white, is now plunged into this COVID epidemic. And what's happening to them obviously is a lot of them work in retail, for instance, non-essential retail, so they've lost their jobs. And since a lot of those jobs will never come back, you've got a real worry about mass unemployment. Mass unemployment that would further worsen the terms of trade between capital and labor. The other thing, the post-COVID, that we think about a lot is the healthcare system. So, the COVID epidemic has shown what a catastrophe it is to have healthcare tied to employment, because you lose your job, you lose your healthcare. Anna and I sort of see this future for the healthcare as going in two different directions. And one is they emerge from this as heroes. The nurses, the doctors, the hospitals, they saved us. And they came up with a vaccine and a drug, and we think this is wonderful and we love them. On the other hand, there may be people with broken bank accounts, broken credits for the rest of their lives, a lot of people dying, a lot of people with lifelong injuries from this thing. We don't know what it might do to people, and with terrible medical bills and the inability through money, to get access to medicines or vaccines. And that might break it.
You speak of society coming apart and these multiple fonts of despair within society, one of which, of course, is race. And as we speak, as we record this, that is again spilled out on the streets of every major city in the US. Any reflections?
I think this is incredibly volatile. And if I were to make predictions about that, I just look very stupid down the way. I probably look stupid enough already. But there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of despair out there. And this is a very, very volatile mix. I mean, we still see the 60s when there was the Vietnam War, when there was the racial issues were polarized, as now the cities were being burned. And that really is a hinge point in American history, in that everything got realigned after that. This could be much bigger than that. If you said 40 years ago that inequality would have gotten a lot worse, people would have said, well, there'll be a revolution. There hasn't been a revolution. Maybe it'll get worse still and there won't be a revolution. Maybe this time will be too much. We don't know what will happen if this comes apart, but I'm very fearful of the future.
In your book, The Great Escape, there is this calibrated optimism. As you look at the situation today, do you see a route to escape?
I have not forgone the optimism that I expressed in that book. The basic argument there was that the force of reason really did change the world. And I was never totally over-optimistic, because silly accounts of the whole thing will tell you that there's been steady progress since the steam engine was invented or something, which is just not true. And what's more, some of the most awful periods in history were in the 20th century, with the Great Leap Forward and Stalin and Mao and Hitler. And so, it's never been a steady progress. It's been something that goes up and then, comes back. But it always goes up in the end. And that's because we always have reason. We want to be better. We want the world to be better for our children. But right now, we may be going into one of those dark phases. And it may take 20 or 30 years before we see progress